My name is Emily Pinckney. I use she, her, they, them pronouns, and I am the director of fleet electrification for the Breaking Barriers Collaborative, which is it's a part of Climate Solutions, which is a climate and clean energy policy nonprofit that operates both in Washington as well as Oregon. And you'll see today in this presentation, I'll probably do a little bit more of a focus on Washington. I grew up here. I know a lot of context about here, and is where we're focusing on a lot of our efforts right now. But specifically today, I want to talk about, and this has been great hearing the other presentations about sharing and collaboration and community, because that's exactly where I'm going as well. But I'm going to talk to you all about, how in the Pacific Northwest, we are using this, collaborative, community-based effort to be able to accelerate our fleet electrification. And we're doing this model with equity at the center of it. And so I'll talk to you a little bit about the model that we're using to do this. But first, let me talk to you a little bit about who I am. So when I'm not doing fleet electrification work, I'm the co-chair for the Seattle Green New Deal Oversight Board. And part of my role there is to, help advise and inform the city on how to spend Green New Deal dollars. So whether that's on fleet electrification, building decarbonization, but all the way to talking about parks, community centers, resilience hubs. And then when I'm not doing that, I'm also with the Puget Sound Clean Air Agency, also part of the Zero Emissions Truck Collaborative. And then one that's near and dear to my heart that I get to be on the board of is the Zero Emission Vehicles Cooperative, which is a low cost, all electric vehicle rideshare program. And we specifically partner with nonprofits that are serving underserved communities so that we can increase this vision of shared mobility and health. But also, I consider myself this lifelong community servant. I've always been very involved. My family's been very involved, and I deeply care about climate issues, particularly in the climate context. I've always looked at where the need is. People will look at my resume and be like, "You started as a marine biologist and wildlife management scientist," which I still very much am and love to do. I've worked in labs, zoos, and aquariums, but have moved over into the policy space and the implementation space because that is where the need is. Particularly for communities that are hit first and worst by climate change, which are, largely Black and Brown communities, low income communities, and thinking about my own personal experiences of living in a historical Black community growing up, and that community being one of the most polluted in the state of Washington. And I do truly believe that, bringing science into the policy space can help inform, more effective climate policy, and then putting people and planet at the center of that. So you'll hear me talk a lot about environmental justice today and how, our model really hones in on that and how that is really the key to fighting climate change. So before I get too deep into it, I like to show this slide. It's one of my absolute favorites because it has justice on there as well. Especially now that I've kind of been working more in transportation spaces, I will get questions from folks like, why don't you focus on equality? Well, as you can see in this image, not everybody has the resources or the things that they need to thrive, and using equity as a tool to reach justice. And I kind of look at the work that we do, particularly with fleet electrification, as kind of a new frontier. Like, we're pioneering this space, and because feels so new and so different, like this is an opportunity for us to do this right the first time and make sure that justice is at the center of everything that we do. So why transportation? So this is Washington State. So, this is from 2021, the greenhouse gas emissions report. And you can see that transportation is the largest source of emissions, which is part of the reason why I've focused on that. And I'll talk more in this presentation about specifically the impacts of that and who it impacts. But, it's funny because I'll bring up the pandemic and specifically, sorry, it's like somebody, can you mute on the other end there? But specifically, I like to talk about, quarantine and how, during that time in 2020 and 2021, we saw, very few individual drivers on the road. Like we were seeing globally that, air pollution was decreasing. People were like, I can now see these mountains I never was able to see before because there's so much less pollution from those drivers. However, I also bring up the fact that because we were, quarantined, everyone was ordering groceries. We were ordering our sourdough starter kits, our Snuggies, our wine cases. And, there was actually, still a large amount of commercial vehicles that were on the road, particularly once we started to get into 2021. And the difference is that, even though we aren't quarantined like we were before, that commercial vehicle usage is still up and maintained because we've kind of gotten used to, this convenience culture. And it's also been great for folks who need to have deliveries that aren't able to like accessibly leave their homes. But over the past 30 years in the United States, medium and heavy duty vehicles have actually increased on our highways. And those are like the absolute largest sources of emission out there. So I'm going to talk about who is impacted by this. So right now, what we're looking at, these are two maps, and I love talking about maps. I'm such a map nerd, but this one specifically on the left is a redlining map. And for folks who, aren't aware, redlining, nowadays is now just referred to as like racial discrimination practices in housing. However, that word comes from the federal maps that, were created by the federal government. And what they did was they, explicitly outlined, these communities where Black residents lived, and those places were deemed as risky investments. This also is not just for Black residents, but also folks who were immigrants. And the maps were created to help, low income and middle class, like white families, to be able to get homes. But Black and brown people were left out of those investments. And, this explicitly ranked loan worthiness. So let's get into it. So this map right here on the left, you can see there's these different colors. Green is A-graded communities. Those are communities that are the best communities to live, right? So those are the ones that have a high loan worthiness. And then the blue is still desirable. The reason it is blue is because it touches a zone that is yellow. And then yellow is definitely declining, which is C, and then D is hazardous, and that's red. And then you'll also see there's E at the bottom. Those are the, cross-sectioned areas on that map that are indicating business and industrial districts. Now, looking at this map, I can tell you just from knowing these communities and the demographics, and we'll get more into that in the next slide. But for instance, that lower left corner where you see a lot of red, that's Duwamish tribal land. So we have a lot of indigenous folks and immigrants living over there. The bottom left hand or right hand side where you see yellow, there's a lot of immigrant communities, a lot of Asian and African immigrants that live there. And then that red area that you see that's in the middle of the map, a little bit to the right, is the first Black community in the city of Seattle called the Central District. Those were places that had, lower loan worthiness. Those were places where you would find Black and brown folks. And those folks were, shut out of building generational wealth. Now I want you to look at the map on the right here. So this map on the right is traffic proximity. And so if you see yellow, orange, or red, that's a lot of traffic. There's also this red line going down the middle of this map. That is the I-5 corridor, one of the largest highways on the West Coast. It goes all the way up to Canada and has a lot of traffic on there, particularly industrialized traffic. And so you can see that those same communities that are on the left are very, very close to, where all this traffic is. Also, before we move forward, if you look at the places that are business and industrial on the red line map, that's where the port is. There's a lot of industrial port activities. And then also today, that's where we have, like, for instance, like the Boeing airfield is out there, as well as one of the largest, like, concrete plants. So now keeping this redlining map on the screen for context, and then looking at this other one on the right, which is the Racial and Social Equity Index. On that map on the right, this is a map from the 2020s. The map on the left is from the 1930s. They look quite similar still. The one on the right specifically is looking at, different types of demographics. So it's looking at racial demographics. It's also looking at folks who identify as non-white and folks who identify as non-English speakers or English as a second language, as well as folks who are low income. And, you can just see on this map like this darker red area all the way to like, the kind of orangey color. Those are places that are deemed at a higher disadvantage, that have a higher priority. And this specifically is looking at like health impacts. And so looking at these two maps, not a lot has changed from the 1930s to now. These communities and their demographics look largely the same. And so let's overlay some of these maps. So specifically looking at these ones here, you can see on the left. So this one right here has A graded areas. Remember, A graded is best. That's those green areas that you see the little boxes. And then the one on the right is the D graded areas. Those are the red areas, the red lined areas. And these boxes are overlined on a pollution map. The darker the brown, the more pollution. The lighter the brown, the least pollution. And you can see by the A graded areas that they are specifically all in these areas away from the highway, away from industry. Also, if you know anything about Seattle, those areas are all located along the water. And if you know anything about Seattle today, those are all multi-million-dollar homes. So that equity has been built over time. And then looking at this one over here on the right side, like these are the same exact communities. So remember I said Central District is a historical Black community. They all have those red graded lines, as well as South Park down there, that is tribal communities and immigrant communities. And a lot of them are largely on the highway or around industrial practices. And the quote over here to the right I'm going to read is, these maps, which were drawn by people who are no longer alive today, this racist urban planning from the 1930s is still having an impact on air pollution inequality that we face today. And this is a quote from Julian Marshall, who was one of the authors of this report, which created these maps. And he's also a professor with the University of Washington. And so thinking about who are these folks that are breathing in this burden. So housing costs are so high today, and on top of the, historical redlining discrimination, it's communities of color and low income folks who always live around these industrial sites and port areas. And I can say that, I used to live in the city of Tacoma. I lived near the port of Tacoma, and now I live by the port of Seattle, which brings me to my next point, is that communities of color, no matter their income level, will always be exposed to these higher levels of pollution. And because of that, there's increased health impacts, there's increased emergency room visits, lung ailments, heart issues, and developmental disorders, as well as, pregnant people, being at higher risk for premature death. And then I also think about the driver's health. So up here in particular, we have a lot of immigrants and, BIPOC folks who are the people who are the truck drivers, the people who are doing these 12-hour long hauls, and dealing with, diesel exhaust inside their cabs, and also dealing with psychological issues. And it can lead to things like lung cancer and cardiovascular issues. And it's something that I feel like folks don't really think about, is like, who are the people who actually are driving our goods, to us? And they're driving through the same communities in which they live. However, this study came out from USC, and in this study, it talks about how communities that have higher levels of electric vehicle adoption have less emergency room visits and better air quality. This study also points out, though, that there's this adoption gap. So communities, particularly the communities that are hit first and worst by climate change, communities of color, low income communities, that they have less opportunity to purchase electric vehicles. And part of that is like those upfront costs. Even if the total cost of ownership of the life of the vehicle is more affordable in the long run, it's the upfront cost of the vehicle, the upfront cost of charging stations. And so part of what we've done is figure out, okay, who are the folks who are driving through these communities? What are the vehicles that are going through there? Who is on the I-5 corridor? And so that's how we created the Breaking Barriers Collaborative. And so this is a program that we created in 2023. And we realized, we need to work with the folks who have these vehicles on the road. And so that's businesses, nonprofits, governments, even school districts, universities, and work with them to help them accelerate their fleet decarbonization plans. And we realized that these folks represent hundreds of thousands of vehicles, in both the state of Washington and the state of Oregon. The Breaking Barriers Collaborative, these are some of our founding organizations, which is, of course, Climate Solutions, the group that I'm a part of, but also the Washington Build Back Black Alliance, Clean and Prosperous Institute, Oregon Businesses for Climate, and the Wave Northwest. And these are like five incredible nonprofits that have all really worked hard to build rigorous climate policy. But if you know anything about the Pacific Northwest, we've got some great climate policy and we're not doing so great on implementation. And we decided that it was time to build a space where folks who have these shared fleet electrification goals could come to and actually realize those goals and have support with that, because it is not as easy as just, buying an electric vehicle and a charger. You have to really work through these plans, particularly the larger the organization is. It's got to be an effort that's, will take the course of several years to get to, your end goal. And so the model that we did was we created the Fleet Electrification Accelerator. And I love talking about this model because I want to share this with as many people as possible because we have found success in it. And I'm hoping that other people in other places can replicate it. And we've already been asked by other places, like, how do you do this? And so, of course, we do this like mixture of learning where we'll have a program depending on who's in the cohort, how much time we have, about 8 to 12 weeks, where we're doing, different types of learnings. Each week is a different topic. Like this week, we're focused on utilities. Next week, we're focused on infrastructure. After that, fleet operations, change management. And so we do that throughout those weeks. We also, get folks to do homework, working on their plans, and we work on it step by step with them. And then the part that I love the most, that we hear that others love the most, is our cohort and our mentors, being able to work with people. Like, doesn't matter what your job is, we are all in the business of relationships, and building relationships and communities around this work has really helped people to push their work forward. And so I love showing this slide because I always tell folks, I'm like, you actually aren't going to hear from me a lot from the program. You're going to hear from all these people. We bring the utilities in to, meet with people and talk with them directly. A lot of utilities right now, they have a long list of folks who want to start electrifying, whether that's their fleets or working on, electrifying buildings. But when we work with them, we are sending participants from our program to them with full electrification plans in place, making their job a lot easier to be able to, help them with their power demand. And what I always say about utilities, talk to them early and often, right? And so making sure that you build that relationship with them early on. And then also we have, fleet managers from all over the country that we've brought in who've fully done, their fleet electrification work, who can come share best practices, where there's barriers and, where are the pitfalls, and trying to figure out how to help folks get along. And then policy experts, which has been surprisingly one of the best groups of folks that we've had in the room, because every single time there are issues that people in our program face or any type of barriers, they can speak directly with the people who are creating the policy, incentives, and laws that govern how folks can move forward with fleet electrification. And then we also have a lot of other folks that have a stake in this, like Electrification Coalition or like Clean Cities groups. And, them coming in and sharing their expertise has been incredibly helpful for our program, especially because they're all so diverse, with so much deep knowledge. And then the doing, right? We want to get people to actually work hands on and understand what they're doing through the process. We help them build a full fleet electrification plan. It's like, we're helping them build a story. The story's got about 10 chapters, and each chapter is these different elements. We help them build a total cost of ownership analysis. And we use a tool actually called the Drive tool, which is publicly available. It's a tool that was created by Electrification Coalition. And with that tool, you can put in what your vehicles are, what your use case is, and what region you live in. And what comes out of that tool is, here's vehicles that are available, here's incentives that are available, and here are some of the best routes to take. And then one of the most important parts of this is, helping people with an equity route analysis. So where are we decarbonizing vehicles first? Where are the communities that are hit first and worst by climate change? Where are the communities that have the worst air pollution right now? Let's prioritize those. Let's make sure that if your vehicles are going through there, that they are electric. And then helping like folks, identify what vehicles work for their use case, what type of charging that they need, helping them with site evaluations. And then always my favorite is we do a lot of ride and drives. Sometimes it takes getting people behind the wheel to understand how awesome, these vehicles can be. They're quiet, they're clean, and a lot of people like to drive them. And if you're a person who drives an electric car, you know that it has a little bit of torque. So people do like to go fast. And so it's been a great experience to do that with people. And then we help them do things like identify incentives. That has been an ever-changing field, particularly with federal funding cuts, because it's been impacting also local funding sources. But we still have been able to find a lot of, money that is available, particularly in the Pacific Northwest. And then another very important one is workplace training and particularly change management, right? Because some of the folks, particularly thinking of maintenance and drivers, they've been working with gas and diesel vehicles for sometimes over 20 years. And so now we have to help them and train them to be able to work with electric vehicles and pretty much become electricians at this point. And then the part that I love the most, the part that everyone loves the most, is the community that we build. We always hear from all the different groups that go through our program, and I'll show you all the diversity of organizations in a minute. Is they love the peer gathering, they love the networking and being with each other, learning from other people's successes and the mistakes, and trying to figure out how can we do this collaboratively together. This has kind of been like the bread and butter of this model because, and again, I'm going to show you on the next screen all the people we have, but like we've had every single like Washington state agency go through our program. We've had many Oregon state agencies, many cities, many municipalities, multiple businesses, a bunch of nonprofits and educational like institutions. And as they're working together and planning, they're finding ways to resource each other and work with each other. So if one of them does not have something, how can I work with this other person and use their resources to be able to move in lockstep on our fleet electrification goals? And again, this is my absolute favorite part because wind blows and water flows. What happens in the city of Seattle will impact the city of Tacoma. So if they're both in this program, they can communicate and talk with each other in a way that they may have not been able to do before because, we get so siloed in our work, particularly folks who are in government spaces. We also have an alumni program that we've just developed where we can continue to work with folks and continue to give them resources. Because, like I said, even though our program is 8 to 12 weeks, this is a multi-year, multi-step process for a lot of organizations in the program. And then we also offer them with free one-on-one consulting, and we do that with Electrification Coalition. So people are able to get all their tailored needs and have very specific issues answered by an organization that's already done this with many different, cities, organizations, and in groups. And then we keep them deeply connected with all the subject matter experts because, again, after the program ends, like people still have questions. They're still working on this. And this landscape, as fun as and exciting as it can be, it's also ever changing. I feel like there's new news every single day about electric vehicles. And then this is just a sneak peek of all the organizations that have been in our program. It's funny because I could not fit everybody on here. There's no way I could. There's been so many. And looking at this covers hundreds of thousands of vehicles between Washington and Oregon State. This is a lot of impact. And so all of these groups right now are in the process of transitioning their vehicles. And the impact that that will have to community is just it's so real. And that's part of what we do is we're here to make it real. And I always like to show this because I get really excited seeing that a model like this that builds community has actually helped people. People really feel like they can confidently do this work, and we demystify the process, right? And give them step-by-step ways of how to do this, but also build this community and collaboration. And I just want to share some of our grad success stories. So we had Skanska in our program, large international construction company. And, they decided like, we're only moving forward with electric vehicles in our operations from now on. And I was like, yes, We did it. And in the left corner is the electric excavator pilot that they ran in LA. And, it cut about 66% of emissions per hour and saved 74% in operating costs. And when we talk about the cost savings and the benefits, like that has been a huge way to get particularly businesses into our program, which at sometimes have been at odds with climate progress. And so it's been a way to get them involved in the conversation because it's going to take all of us, to move forward with this work. And then MTR Western, I will say I have a huge place in my heart for them. They have been on the forefront and been very aggressively pushing electrification. And in 2023, they finally introduced their fully electric bus, which is super cool. I remember they turned it on and I was like, I can't hear anything. I can hear the birds in downtown Seattle. Like, it was a beautiful moment. And the bus, it goes from Seattle to Bellingham, which is about 3 hours away, back down to Seattle with 30% charge still left in this bus. And it saves about 10,000 gallons of diesel fuel annually and reduces, CO2 emissions by 109 tons. And they're an awesome motor coach company. But there's still some challenges. These are the challenges that we've directly heard from people in our program, and so I want to like share those with you all today. Like some of the challenges, of course, is like grid and grid capacity. Like there's so much energy being used, especially with like the spread of data centers around the country, and so we are really looking for a power demand, particularly for our governments who have very aggressive climate goals in our region, being able to do that, as well as things like permitting constraints and figuring out where can we put our infrastructure if we can't put it in these places, right? And then another issue, which this is a really big one, is medium and heavy duty vehicle availability. There's only so many vehicles that are available right now for people's particular use cases. And also, some of the medium heavy duty vehicles that are out there are very expensive. And so companies are finding it difficult to be able to continue on their transition once they get past this phase of, light duty vehicles, and like smaller like vans and smaller like things like pickup trucks. And that brings me, of course, to funding and costs. I think this is honestly this is an issue for everybody right now, and with federal funding cuts, it has gotten very difficult for some organizations to continue on their work, and actually has led to some folks stalling out in their plans to electrify, and particularly with companies where part of the reason they were making the transition in the first place was cost savings, not necessarily because they had strong climate goals, but was because of the cost savings. And so we're seeing some companies and organizations pull back on their climate promises. And this also brings me to change management, which is always going to be something that I think will be an issue because, we're now in these virtual spaces where we're online a lot. Maybe people are a little more siloed in their work, and change management is really about relationships, relationship building, understanding people's goals and their motives and their needs. And a lot of times we see change management either being difficult with like executive level staff, so people who are the decision makers, and then also very difficult, like I said earlier, with like folks who are maintenance and drivers. And part of it is because their whole jobs for years have been based on gas and diesel vehicles. And so it's a cultural shift. But again, get folks behind the wheel, they get convinced pretty quick.
And
But I
Emily,
just want to,
I just want
yeah.
to draw your attention to the time at 12:30.
Okay, can I two more
Please do.
slides? Can I finish them?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, sorry about that. But yes, I just want to, before I move on, so like just want to leave you with this and then have one more slide. So particularly the thing that's been super beneficial has been the peer diversity of these groups. And of course, like I said, the community that they've been able to build, learning from people in different spaces and industries has been so helpful for people to, actually realize their fleet electrification goals. And then building these concrete roadmaps, like I said, it feels sometimes like a very big or like nebulous type idea to be able to go to fully electric, but it is possible with help and support and your community behind you. And then also having it focused on equity. We know that the communities that are hit first and worst by climate change, when we do prioritize that, the whole community is served. That, we will be lowering our whole state's air pollution if we really focus on environmental justice communities. And then the relationships that are formed, both with outside external organizations, but also within organizations. I've had people in this program who are like, I've spent more time with my coworkers than I have actually in my day-to-day job. We've been able to actually focus on fleet electrification and do this plan fully in a way that we weren't able to do it before. And then building momentum in person gatherings. Since the pandemic, it's been very difficult to get people together. But when we have people in person, we can do things like ride and drives. People are humanizing one another and having the ability to really understand where folks are coming from. And then lastly, the regional focus. Focusing on the region means that we are able to have people who are experts with deep knowledge in this work, and that people are able to work with their neighbors. People are able to work with people who live around them. And so they understand each other's issues, and they also understand the demographics and landscapes that they're in. And then let me leave you with this last slide. This is a program that we have just piloted this year called the Small Business EV Launchpad. This is near and dear to my heart. It's very specifically for, tailored for BIPOC small businesses. Each of the businesses, they receive stipends for their participation. We do their fleet electrification plans by like hand holding with them side by side, because if you know anything about running a small business, you're always running a small business. There's no days off. My dad was a small business owner for 30 years. You don't have a lot of time. And so we are trying to make it easier for Black and Brown businesses to also be a part of this conversation and benefit from it, particularly because a lot of these folks are pillars in their community. The businesses that they run are multi-pronged and benefit the spaces in which they live. And a lot of them live in environmental justice communities. We do grant applications for them, and then we also give $25,000 to each of the businesses, which has been great. We've been able to do that because we received a really amazing grant through PSE, which is money from the Climate Commitment Act in Washington State. And through PSE, they can also provide them with a free charger and installation. So that is my time. But here's my information. I'll also put it in the chat. If anyone wants to reach out to me or learn more about this model and how it can be successful.